She looked at the oil stains on the concrete, the chipped linoleum, and the 7-year-old boy coloring at a folding table, and she laughed. It wasn't a loud laugh. It was the dry, quiet exhale of a woman who managed 5,000 employees and had just stepped into a joke. She told him a shop like his shouldn't even bid on a contract that required 3-micron precision. She didn't know the blueprints in her briefcase carried his initials in the bottom right corner. The smell of soluble cutting oil never really washes out. You can scrub with pumice soap until your knuckles bleed, hot water scalding the creases of your palms, but 3 hours later, sitting at the kitchen table, you'll catch it again. Sharp, metallic, slightly sour. Cole Davies didn't bother scrubbing until his knuckles bled anymore. He just washed enough to keep the grease off the bread when he made Leo's sandwiches. Cut the crust diagonally or straight across today? Cole asked, his back to the front counter of the shop. Triangles, Leo said without looking up from his paper. Triangles taste structurally sound. Cole smiled, a faint, tired movement at the corner of his mouth. He pressed the heavy stainless steel knife through the peanut butter and bread, wiped the blade with a rag that lived in his back pocket, and handed the plate across the laminate counter. The shop, Davies Precision and Repair, sat on a frontage road between a failing carpet outlet and a commercial tire depot. The building was cinder block, painted a faded industrial teal 30 years ago by whoever owned it before the bank took it, and before Cole leased it for $2,000 a month. The front room held a glass display case containing nothing except 3 dead houseflies, a stack of faded yellow invoices, and an assortment of custom brass fittings Cole had turned 3 summers ago just to keep his hands moving. Beyond the swinging double doors lay the real space, 1,800 square feet of poured concrete floor housing, a 10-year-old Haas CNC vertical machining center, an old Bridgeport manual knee mill with a loose X-axis dial, a clausing lathe that leaked whey oil onto a sheet of flattened cardboard, and a heavy iron welding table scarred by decade-old arc strikes. It wasn't a facility. It was a workshop. To a passerby, it looked like the kind of place you brought a cracked lawnmower deck or a stripped hydraulic cylinder from a John Deere tractor. And most days, that's exactly what walked through the door. At $85 an hour, turning replacement bushings for local excavators paid for the commercial lease, electricity, health insurance, and the boxes of macaroni and cheese piled in the pantry of their rented duplex 2 miles away. It hadn't always been hydraulic cylinders. 4 years ago, before the hospital monitors stopped beeping, before the 22-month battle with aggressive glioblastoma drained Cole's savings, his focus, and his ability to tolerate 40-person Zoom calls about quarterly KPIs, Cole had been an independent automation systems architect. He worked under an LLC that had no website, hired no junior engineers, and charged $300 an hour to solve problems that corporate engineering teams had spent 18 months butchering. When his wife died, Cole looked at his calendar, looked at 4-year-old Leo sitting on the living room rug with a set of plastic gears, and dissolved the LLC. He bought the Haas machine second-hand from an auction in Cleveland, signed the lease on the frontage road, and dropped off the grid. He didn't miss the glass conference rooms. He didn't miss the venture capitalists who used words like synergy and scalable throughput while pointing at schematics they couldn't read. He liked the weight of raw bar stock. He liked the honest, screaming cut of a carbide end-mill shearing cold-rolled steel at 10,000 revolutions per minute. When a part was right, a micrometer told you it was right to the 10th of a thousandth of an inch. There was no politics in steel. "Dad," Leo said, chewing a triangle. The machine stopped. Cole listened. The background hum of the shop had shifted. The high-pitched whine of the coolant pump on the Haas had cut out, replaced by the distinct dull clack of the spindle coming to a stop and the automatic door unlocking. "Run's done," Cole said. He wiped his hands on his rag, stepped through the swinging doors, and hit the green latch on the CNC enclosure. Warm, damp fog, atomized coolant, drifted out into the shop air, carrying the smell of heated aluminum. He reached inside, unscrewed the fixturing clamp, and pulled out a block of 6061 aluminum shaped like a specialized mounting bracket. He blew the chips off with an air hose, the sharp hiss echoing off the cinder block walls. He picked up his digital calipers, checked the bore diameter, 1.2498 inches, dead on nominal, and tossed it into a plastic bin holding 12 identical pieces. A job for a local bottling plant. $600 total, enough to cover the electric bill and Leo's upcoming dental checkup. He was reaching into the parts hopper to grab another blank piece of stock when the bell above the front office door jingled. It wasn't the slow, heavy ring of a trucker bringing in a broken drive shaft. It was sharp, impatient. Cole wiped his hands again, told Leo to stay put at his coloring table, and pushed through the double doors into the front room. The first thing Cole noticed was the shoes. They were black leather pumps, immaculate and sharp-toed, completely out of place on the oil-stained threshold of his shop. Rising from them was a tailored charcoal pantsuit that cost more than the Bridgeport mill in the back. The woman wearing the suit was in her late 30s. She had sharp facial features, hair pulled back into a low, severe clasp, and dark eyes that were currently scanning the dingy front office with open, unvarnished disdain. She looked at the cracked linoleum, the empty display case, the dust sitting on the window blinds, and finally at Leo, who was staring back at her while holding a blue crayon halfway to his paper. Behind her stood a younger man in a pressed white shirt and gray slacks, clutching a leather portfolio tightly against his chest, looking sweating and miserable. "Can I help you?" Cole asked, stepping behind the counter. He was wearing steel-toed boots, faded Carhartt trousers spotted with dried coolant, and a dark green t-shirt with a hole near the left collarbone. The woman's eyes shifted from Leo to Cole. Her gaze started at his boots, moved slowly up to his unshaven jaw, and settled on his eyes. There was no recognition in her face, only the automatic categorical assessment of a person who evaluated everything by its square footage and quarterly revenue. "I'm looking for the proprietor," she said. Her voice was clean, modulated, and carried the flat, rapid cadence of someone who hadn't waited in a line since the late 90s. "You're looking at him," Cole said. "Cole Davies. What do you need?" The woman sighed, a micro-expression of profound exhaustion, and glanced back at the nervous man holding the portfolio. "Eric, when you told me you found a local shop capable of precision emergency fabrication, I assumed you meant an actual manufacturing facility, not a garage." Eric cleared his throat, his Adam's apple bobbing. "Ms. Holt, the lead engineers at the plant, said, well, they said the major tool and die houses in the city have a 3-week backlog. Someone mentioned this place had a CNC center and could turn rapid prototypes." Vivian Holt turned her attention back to Cole. She didn't offer a hand to shake. She stepped forward, resting one manicured finger on the dusty surface of the laminate counter, then lifting it to inspect the gray smudge on her skin. "We have a situation at our new assembly facility on the north side," Vivian said, wiping her finger on a disposable tissue she pulled from her pocket. "Line 4's halted. We're losing $40,000 an hour because a custom pneumatic manifold on the primary robotic pick-and-place arm failed under pressure stress. The OEM specs were flawed." "Happens," Cole said flatly. "Send the drawings to my email. If I have the aluminum in stock, I can look at it tomorrow morning." Vivian gave a short, dry laugh. It lacked any warmth. "Tomorrow morning costs us another $400,000, Mr. Davies. And looking around this room—" She gestured vaguely toward the ceiling, where a fluorescent tube flickered and hummed. "I don't think you understand the tolerances involved. This isn't a bracket for a tow truck. We run 5-axis, high-speed automated assembly. The manifold requires holding positional tolerances of 5 microns across 6 internal ported channels. If the tool deflects by a hair, the pressure seals blow." Cole leaned his forearms on the counter. He felt the familiar, dull thrum of annoyance he used to get during project status meetings with marketing directors. If you know the tolerances are 5 microns, then you know you don't need a 5-axis machine to bore 6 intersecting orthogonal channels in a block of aluminum. You need a rigid setup, a decent boring head, and someone who knows how to compensate for thermal expansion in the spindle. Vivian blinked, momentarily stalled by the technical terminology coming out of a guy with oil on his knuckles. But she recovered instantly, her armor clicking back into place. "Theory is fine," she said coldly. "Execution requires infrastructure. Look at this place. You have toys on the floor." She pointed a slight gesture toward Leo's small pile of Legos stacked neatly near the table legs. You have a single operator, you, and machinery that looks like it was manufactured during the Bush administration. Eric brought me here out of desperation, but I'm not going to risk further damage to a $20 million production cell by feeding it backyard parts. Leo looked up at his dad. Is she mad at the shop, Dad? No, buddy, Cole said softly, not breaking eye contact with Vivian. She's just stressed because her machines don't work. Vivian's jaw tightened. My machines work fine when they aren't provisioned with substandard engineering. Eric, let's go. Call the outfit in Chicago. Offer them triple overtime to fly a crew out. Ms. Holt, Eric stammered, backing toward the door. Chicago said Tuesday, even with a private charter. The tooling required for the deep hole internal porting, they don't have the blanks cut. Vivian paused with her hand on the brass door handle. Her knuckles whitened. She stood there in the quiet shop, the air smelling of old grease and dust, calculating the brutal arithmetic of a stopped production line. $40,000 an hour. By tomorrow morning, nearly $1 million burned, delivery schedules missed, stock price fluctuating if word got out that her flagship state-of-the-art facility stalled during its second week of operation. She turned around slowly. Show him the schematic, she snapped at Eric. Let's see if he even recognizes the symbology. Eric scrambled forward, unzipping the leather portfolio with shaking fingers. He pulled out a large, C-sized sheet of thick drafting paper, folded into neat quadrants, and spread it out across the laminate counter, pushing aside Cole's coffee mug. Cole didn't move immediately. He picked up his rag, slowly wiped his hands one final time, tucked the cloth into his back pocket, and looked down at the drawing. It was an engineering layout for a high-pressure multi-port distribution block. 12 internal fluid channels intersecting at precise 30-degree angles, feeding 4 high-speed pneumatic actuators. It was a complex, elegant piece of functional geometry designed to operate at 1200 psi without blowing its O-ring seals. Cole didn't just recognize the symbology. He recognized the exact layout of the relief grooves around the secondary mounting holes. He recognized the peculiar, non-standard thread pitch specified for the sensor ports, M8 by 0.75, chosen specifically because standard coarse threads tended to vibrate loose at the operating frequency of that specific robotic arm. He looked at the bottom right corner of the sheet. The title block bore the logo of Holt Advanced Robotics and Automation. But below the logo, in the tiny box marked Original Architect/Consultant, printed in clean, crisp CAD lettering, it read CD-ARCH-2021. Cole stared at the letters. CD Cole Davies, ARCH-2021, 5 years ago. It had been one of his final contracts before his wife's diagnosis became severe. An intermediary agency had paid his LLC $80,000 to design the pneumatic and mechanical handling architecture for a next-generation automated assembly cell. He had spent 3 weeks at a standing desk in his old home office, drinking black coffee at 2 in the morning, calculating fluid dynamics and stress loads for a client whose name was hidden behind a nondescript corporate holding company. He was looking at his own brain work, 5 years removed, printed on fresh paper, and slapped onto his counter by a billionaire who thought he was a shade tree mechanic. Well? Vivian demanded, crossing her arms, her heels clicking as she shifted her weight. Can you read it? Or do you need me to explain what a counterbore is? Cole ran a calloused index finger slowly across the main cross-sectional view of the manifold. The internal intersecting channels, Cole said, his voice quiet and level. Whoever drafted your revision here made a mistake. Vivian let out a sharp, dismissive breath. Excuse me? That revision was signed off by a senior team of engineers with master's degrees from MIT. The failure happened because the metal fatigued under cycle stress, not because the design is flawed. No, Cole said. He tapped a specific intersection point inside the block. Your team changed the internal radii here. See this? They bumped the port diameter from 8 millimeters to 10 to increase flow rate. But by doing that, they reduced the wall thickness between channel B and channel D to less than 1.5 millimeters. Eric leaned over the counter, blinking hard at the drawing. When you run 1200 psi through channel B while channel D is exhausting, Cole continued, pointing his pencil at the stress point, the pressure differential causes the thin wall to flex. It cycle fatigues. After roughly, I'd say 80,000 cycles, the wall microfractures, air bypasses the seal, and your pick-and-place arm loses gripping pressure and drops the payload. Silence fell over the front room. The only sound was the faint hum of the fluorescent tube overhead and the scratching of Leo's blue crayon on paper. Vivian stared at Cole, her arms uncrossed slightly. How do you know our operating pressure is 1200 psi? That isn't listed on this subassembly drawing. Cole didn't look up from the blueprint. Because if you ran it at 800, the actuator cycle time would drop below your target speed of 1.2 seconds per stroke. And if you ran it over 1400, you'd blow the standard commercial solenoid valves down the line. He looked up then, meeting her eyes directly. He saw the flicker of confusion there, the sudden, uncomfortable realization that the man standing on the other side of a dirty counter in a rundown industrial park had just diagnosed a failure that her 20-person engineering department had been scrambling to explain since 6 o'clock that morning. "Can you make it?" she asked. Her tone had lost its mocking edge, replaced by a tense, hard practicality. "Can you machine a replacement block with the corrected internal radii by 7 o'clock tonight?" Cole looked at the clock on the wall. It was 1:30 p.m. "I have a block of 7075 aircraft-grade aluminum on my rack," Cole said. "It's harder and denser than the 6061 you've been using. It'll take the pressure without deflecting. But boring those intersecting holes with manual tool changes on my Haas is going to take 4 hours of uninterrupted machine time, plus an hour to write the G-code and set the tooling." "I don't care how long it takes as long as it's done tonight," Vivian said, pulling out a slim platinum business card and dropping it on the counter. "Name your price. Double your usual emergency rate. Just get the line running." Cole looked at the card, then at Leo, who had finished coloring his triangle and was carefully putting his crayons back into their cardboard box. "My emergency rate is $2,000 for the part," Cole said, "and you don't pay me until you install it and the pressure holds." Vivian looked at him as if he had just offered to work for free. To a woman losing $40,000 every 60 seconds, $2,000 was rounding error on a catering bill. "Fine," she said, turning toward the door. "Eric will wait here to transport the part to the facility the second it comes off the machine." "No," Cole said. Vivian stopped, looking back over her shoulder, her eyes narrowing. "No? Eric doesn't know how to torque the mounting manifold without distorting the aluminum block," Cole said calmly. "If he bolts it down unevenly with an air gun, he'll warp the bore channels and you'll leak pressure anyway. When the part is finished, I bring it over, I install it, and I test it." Vivian looked him up and down one last time. The stained Carhartts, the worn boots, the calm, unblinkingly steady posture. She checked her watch. "Have it at the loading dock by 6:30, she said. "If it works, I'll write you a check for $5,000. If it leaks, don't bother asking for a dime." She pushed open the glass door and walked out into the afternoon heat, her heels clicking sharply against the broken asphalt outside. Eric hurried after her, letting the door swing shut with a hollow rattle. Cole stood at the counter for a long moment, staring down at the drawing. He reached down, traced his thumb over the tiny letters CD-ARCH-2021, and let out a long, quiet breath. "Dad?" Leo asked, sliding off his chair and walking over to stand next to Cole's leg. "Are we going to the big factory tonight?" Cole placed a heavy hand on his son's head, ruffling the soft hair. "Yeah, Leo," Cole said, picking up his calipers and turning back toward the swinging double doors of the shop. "We're going to go fix the lady's machine." The heavy steel vice jaws closed on the solid block of 7075-T651 aluminum with a dull, satisfying thrum. Cole locked down the handle of the curt vise, tapping the top surface of the raw stock with a dead-blow hammer to seat it hard against the precision parallels underneath. He ran his thumb across the metal. Cool, rigid, and dense. Zinc-alloyed aircraft aluminum. It didn't gummy up or tear like cheap 6061 when you pushed a cutter through it. It sheared off in crisp silver needles that sounded like falling glass when they hit the sheet metal chip pan. Across the shop, sitting on an overturned milk crate near the industrial fan, Leo had built a fortress out of cardboard shipping tubes and duct tape. He had his earmuffs resting around his neck, waiting for the spindle to spin up. "Ears on, buddy," Cole called out over the hiss of the airline. Leo slipped the bulky yellow safety muffs over his ears and gave a quick two-finger salute. He knew the drill. The shop wasn't a playground, but it was the only home that made sense to either of them anymore. Cole stepped to the controller panel of the Haas vertical mill. The screen glowed with amber-green text, rows of alphanumeric coordinates lining up like soldiers. G00, G01, X 1.245, Y minus 0.875, Z minus 0.100. Most modern machine shops relied entirely on complex desktop CAM software to generate their toolpaths, clicking buttons with a mouse while sipping cold brew coffee. Cole still wrote his critical internal porting routines by hand at the machine interface. He liked knowing the exact acceleration curve of the axis motors. He liked controlling the chip load to the thousandth of an inch per tooth. When you work for corporate engineering departments, failure is abstract. If a system doesn't perform, you schedule a root cause analysis meeting. You shift the blame to procurement for buying cheap actuators. Or you blame software developers for a lag in the PLC logic. You write a 20-page PDF report with pie charts, attach a revised budget, and bill the client for the extra hours. Machining wasn't like that. In front of a spinning spindle, physics did not care about your resume. Physics did not care if your name was on the building or if your shoes cost $1,200. If your tool pressure was too high, the carbide end mill snapped with a sharp, violent gunshot that made your teeth ache. If your feed rate was too slow, the tool rubbed instead of cutting, work hardening the metal until the bit burned red hot and welded itself to the part. There were no meetings to explain away a scrapped part. It either held tolerance when you dropped the bore gauge inside, or you threw it in the recycling bin and started over. That honesty was what had saved Cole's life 4 years ago. During those first 6 months after the funeral, the quiet in the house had been loud enough to crack his skull open. Every corner of the drywall, every scratch on the hardwood floor held a memory of a life that had been permanently derailed. He had tried sitting at his home office desk to finish a consultation contract for an automotive parts distributor in Detroit, but staring at the dual monitors only made his hands shake. He couldn't build abstract systems anymore when his own internal structure had collapsed, so he bought the second-hand Haas. He bought heavy chunks of scrap iron and raw bar stock from a liquidator. He spent 12 hours a day standing on the concrete floor until his lower back throbbed and his heels went numb, forcing his brain to focus entirely on speeds, feeds, and the absolute geometric truth of the Cartesian coordinate system. He pressed the green cycle start button. The enclosure door locked with a heavy metallic clack. Inside the cabinet, the spindle spun up to 8,000 revolutions per minute, a rising, high-pitched turbine whine that vibrated through the soles of Cole's boots. 2 high-pressure nozzles pointed at the tool holder opened up, flooding the workspace with a thick, milky stream of water-soluble coolant. The 3/4-inch roughing end mill dropped down. It hit the top face of the aluminum block. Scree, chug, chug, chug. The sound was violent and rhythmic as the tool plowed through the metal, stripping away a 1/4-inch depth of cut in a single, aggressive pass. Heavy, curled chips of hot aluminum slammed against the polycarbonate viewing window. Cole didn't move away. He stood inches from the glass, his eyes fixed on the load meter on the display screen. Spindle load holding steady at 42%. No vibration, no chatter. Just the clean, brutal efficiency of rigid steel slicing through alloy. For the next 3 hours, Cole worked the machine like a surgical instrument. He swapped the roughing end mill for a long-reach carbide ball-nose tool to contour the external mounting relief grooves. He loaded a specialized carbide drill bit, through coolant enabled, pushing fluid directly through tiny holes in the drill body to blast chips out of the deep internal cavities, to bore the 12 intersecting channels that Vivian Holt's engineers had compromised. At 5:15, the spindle wound down to a silent stop. The coolant nozzles dripped their final milky drops into the pan below. Cole pulled open the door. A warm cloud of steam drifted out, carrying that familiar sharp scent of heated oil and clean metal. He unstitched the vise, grabbed the block with a gloved hand. It was still warm to the touch, and carried it over to his granite surface plate. He didn't rush. Rushing at the final inspection station was how you missed a burr that later sheared off inside a hydraulic seal and destroyed a $10,000 valve bank. He spent 20 minutes deburring every internal intersection with a set of microfiles and an optical inspection scope. Then he picked up his dial bore gauge, zeroed it against a calibrated master ring, and slipped the measuring head into the primary pressure channel. The needle on the dial face swept across the numbers and stopped dead on zero. 1.2500 inches. Not a 10,000th over, not a 10,000th under. The wall thickness between channel B and channel D sat at a robust, unyielding 3.2 millimeters, more than double the strength of the failing factory part. Cole wiped the pristine block down with solvent until it gleamed under the overhead shop lights. It looked like a piece of industrial jewelry, complex, heavy, completely devoid of decoration, and built to survive a bomb blast. "Pack your coloring book, Leo," Cole said, reaching for his battered heavy-duty canvas tool bag. "Let's go see how the other half lives." The North Side Industrial Corridor had been nothing but empty soybean fields and scrub brush 6 years ago. Now it looked like a science fiction movie campus dropped squarely onto the edge of the county line. Cole eased his 14-year-old Ford F-150 off the 4-lane highway and into the turning lane for Holt Advanced Robotics and Automation. The truck's power steering pump let out its customary low, complaining whine as he straightened out onto the long, landscaped approach drive. The tailgate had a dent from a backed-into forklift 2 winters ago, and the rear bed contained a secured steel toolbox, 2 empty plastic pallets, and a spare tire chained to the bulkhead. Ahead of them rose a quarter-mile stretch of matte gray structural steel, reflective glass panels, and manicured lawns that looked like they were trimmed with nail clippers. "Whoa," Leo murmured, his face pressed against the passenger side window. "It's bigger than the stadium, Dad. Almost 700,000 square feet," Cole said, shifting the truck into lower gear as they approached the primary security checkpoint. "Climate-controlled throughout. They run the entire facility at 68 degrees, so the framing steel doesn't expand and contract during the seasonal shifts." "How do you know that?" Cole kept his eyes on the road. "Because I told them they had to when they were figuring out the foundation specs." At the guardhouse, a security contractor in a crisp black uniform stepped out, holding a digital tablet and frowning at the front grille of Cole's truck. He looked past the hood, scanning the cab, a guy in faded work clothes and a 7-year-old kid in a seatbelt. "Deliveries go to Gate 4 at the rear perimeter," the guard said, leaning toward the driver's side window without raising the automated boom gate. "And standard shipping hours closed at 5 o'clock. You'll have to come back Monday morning." "I'm not a delivery," Cole said, resting his forearm on the open window ledge. "My name is Cole Davies. I have an emergency component for Line 4. Vivian Holt told me to be here by 6:30. The guard's expression didn't change. He tapped his finger on his tablet screen, scrolled down, and shook his head. "I don't have a Davies on the vendor access roster for today. Look, pal, I can't let unauthorized civilian vehicles onto the internal access roads. Back it up and turn around before you block the shift change traffic." Behind them, a sleek black Mercedes sedan pulled up, waiting in line. The driver tapped his horn twice. Short, impatient bursts. Cole didn't reach for his phone. He didn't argue with the guard. He simply reached over to the dashboard, turned off the F-150's engine, pulled the keys out of the ignition, and dropped them into his shirt pocket. "What are you doing?" the guard snapped, his hand resting on his utility belt. "You can't park here." "I have a part sitting on the floorboards that costs $40,000 an hour. Every 60 seconds it isn't bolted to a robotic arm," Cole said calmly. "Call Eric and Ms. Holt's office. Or tell the guy in the Mercedes behind me he's going to be sitting here until 9 o'clock tonight. It makes no difference to me. I get paid by the part, not by the hour." The guard stared at him, his face flushing dark red under his cap. He opened his mouth to issue a formal order to vacate, but before he could speak, the side door of the guardhouse swung open. Eric came running out into the evening heat. His gray slacks were wrinkled at the knees, his tie was pulled loose at the collar, and his forehead was slick with sweat. "Open the gate! Let him through!" Eric shouted, waving his arms at the guard. "Jesus, Gary, that's him! Why is he still sitting here?" The guard blinked, looked at his tablet, then at Eric. "He wasn't logged in the system, Mr. Vance." "I don't care about the system!" Eric yelled, running up to the passenger side of the truck and looking inside. He saw the shiny, precision-machined aluminum block sitting on a clean rag on the floorboard beneath Leo's feet. His shoulders dropped in a visible heave of relief. "You brought it. Thank God. Ms. Holt has been pacing the perimeter corridor for 40 minutes. Park at loading bay 3. I'll escort you directly to the clean floor." Cole started the truck. The boom gate swung upward. They left the F-150 parked between two pristine white company vans at the rear dock. Cole slung his heavy canvas tool bag over his right shoulder, picked up the precision aluminum manifold with his left hand, and told Leo to stick close to his belt loop. They stepped through the heavy double-access doors and into the facility. The air inside hit them immediately, cool, crisp, smelling faintly of ionized electricity and filtered ventilation. The noise wasn't the chaotic, deafening roar of a traditional stamping plant. It was a layered, synchronized symphony of high-tech manufacturing. Pneumatic actuators clicked and hissed. High-speed linear conveyor belts hummed as they moved trays of components along overhead rails. Rows of 6-axis yellow robotic arms pivoted, dipped, and rotated with terrifying, graceful speed behind protective sheets of clear macrolon guarding. Cole walked down the central aisle, his boots clicking softly on the sealed epoxy floor. He didn't look at the machines with awe. He looked at them like an architect reading a finished building he had sketched on a napkin. He recognized the primary framing columns, spaced exactly 42 feet apart to allow for the turning radius of automated guided vehicles. He saw the overhead utility gantries carrying the high-voltage drops and compressed air mains, painted color-coded blue and yellow, running in the exact parallel grids he had mapped out inside his CAD software 5 years ago. He looked at the structural brackets holding the overhead transfer rails to the ceiling joists. They were his design, modified slightly by some junior draftsman who had rounded off the mounting ears to save 10 cents worth of steel per bracket, but undeniably his footprint. It was strange. Walking through your own mind made manifest in 10,000 tons of concrete, wire, and steel, knowing that nobody in the building had the slightest idea who put the walls where they stood. "Dad," Leo whispered, pointing toward a massive glass-enclosed control room sitting on a raised mezzanine above the factory floor. "That lady is looking at us again." Cole looked up. Standing at the edge of the mezzanine railing, looking down at the expansive manufacturing floor beneath her, was Vivian Holt. Even from 50 yards away, Cole could see the tight, rigid posture of a CEO whose flagship facility was limping. She caught sight of Cole's faded green t-shirt and canvas bag moving through the sea of white lab coats and corporate badges. She didn't wave. She turned on her heel and headed toward the metal staircase leading down to the production floor. Line 4 sat in the center of the facility like a dead engine in a race car. While the surrounding assembly bays hummed with automated activity, Bay 4C was completely static. Warning beacons atop the safety enclosures flashed a slow, pulsing amber. Inside the protective glass cells stood a massive, custom-built robotic arm, a 6-foot-tall mechanical limb capable of picking up a 30-pound subassembly and placing it within 2 microns of accuracy every 1.5 seconds. Right now, the arm hung limp, its wrist joint frozen halfway through a rotation cycle, hovering over an empty conveyor pallet. Around the base of the cell stood 4 men in clean white shopcoats holding clipboards and digital tablets. They were arguing in low, tense voices, pointing at the open access panel on the shoulder joint of the robotic arm. Vivian arrived at the bay at the exact same moment Cole and Leo walked up. "Did you test the tolerances on the bench?" Vivian asked immediately, ignoring any pleasantries, her dark eyes darting from Cole's face to the shiny block of alloy in his left hand. "It's dead on," Cole said, setting down his canvas bag on a clean aluminum rolling cart nearby. "Where's the failed unit?" One of the engineers, a tall guy in his late 20s with immaculate hair and a badge that read Lead Automation Systems, turned around, frowning at Cole. He looked down at Leo, who had pulled a small toy car out of his pocket and was quietly rolling it along the lower rail of the rolling cart. "Who is this guy, Ms. Holt?" the engineer asked, stepping between Cole and the open cell door. "We're in the middle of a diagnostic protocol. You can't bring outside maintenance personnel onto a clean automated line without safety clearance." "He's the machinist Eric found," Vivian said sharply. "He brought the replacement manifold. Step aside, Kevin." Kevin didn't step aside. He looked at the machined block in Cole's hand, his lip curling slightly. "We don't even know if this piece conforms to our cleanroom particulate standards, and replacing that manifold requires stripping down the secondary cooling lines and resetting the absolute encoder values on the wrist joint. If he slips with a wrench inside that housing, he could damage the internal wiring harness. My team can handle the installation once the part is verified by QA." Cole didn't look at Kevin. He looked over Kevin's shoulder, straight into the open access hatch on the robotic arm. "If your team knew how to handle the installation," Cole said, his voice dropping into that flat, quiet register he used when a part was about to scrap out on the mill, "you wouldn't have stripped the top 2 mounting threads on the aluminum backing plate when you tried to pull the original part at noon today." Kevin's face froze. His eyes widened slightly. "How could you possibly know that?" Kevin stammered. "Because I can see the aluminum shavings sitting on the bottom ledge of the casting from right here," Cole said, pointing a finger past the engineer's chest. "You used a standard pneumatic impact driver to back out a set of M8 stainless steel socket head cap screws that had been locked down with high-strength thread locker. You galled the threads. That's why you haven't put a temporary bypass block on it yet, because you knew if you bolted something back onto that plate, the top 2 bolts would pull right out under pressure." Silence descended on the group of engineers. 2 of the junior guys shifted their weight, looking down at their boots. Vivian turned her sharp gaze onto Kevin. Her face was ice. "Is that true? Did you damage the mounting plate casting?" It was seized, Ms. Holt," Kevin said defensive, his voice rising an octave. "The thread locker was over-applied at the factory. It's a minor thread pull. We were going to helicoil the holes before reassembly." "Get out of the cell," Vivian said. "Ms. Holt, move!" she commanded, her voice barely louder than the ambient hum of the overhead fans, but carrying enough weight to flatten everyone in the immediate radius. Kevin stepped back, his face burning crimson, shooting a venomous look at Cole as he retreated toward the edge of the conveyor line. Cole didn't waste time gloating. He unzipped his canvas bag and pulled out his tools: a set of T-handle metric hex drivers, a small brass wire brush, a bottle of acetone, and a high-end digital torque wrench encased in a protective blow-molded case. He stepped into the robotic cell, his boots clicking on the steel decking inside. "Keep an eye on my toolbox, buddy," Cole called back to Leo. "Got it, Dad," Leo said, leaning his elbows on the rolling cart, watching his father work with practiced familiarity. Cole reached into the shoulder joint of the machine. Working with steady, unhurried efficiency, he disconnected the 6 flexible polyurethane air lines feeding the old block, plugging their open ends with clean plastic stoppers so ambient dust wouldn't enter the pneumatic system. He loosened the remaining mounting bolts, wiggled the damaged, cracked factory manifold off its positioning pins, and pulled it out into the light. He turned it over and held it up for Vivian to see. Right down the center of the block, between Channel B and Channel D, ran a hairline jagged crack along the thin internal wall, exactly where he had pointed his pencil on the blueprint 5 hours earlier. Vivian looked at the fracture. She didn't say a word, but her jaw muscles tightened until her cheekbones stood out in sharp relief. Cole turned back to the machine. He used his brass brush and a rag soaked in acetone to meticulously clean the mounting face on the robot's arm casting. He inspected the stripped threads Kevin had left behind. Instead of drilling them out for a helicoil, which would leave loose metal chips inside the sensitive joint housing, he pulled a specialized bottoming thread chaser from his bag and carefully, hand turned by hand, cleaned and reformed the distorted aluminum threads until they accepted a screw smoothly. He positioned the new 7075 alloy block over the alignment dowels. It slid into place with a crisp, perfect mechanical fit, metal mating against metal with zero slop. He inserted the 4 mounting bolts. He didn't use an impact gun. He used his T-handle hex keys to run the bolts down until they just touched the face of the block. Then he opened the case for his digital torque wrench. 22 Newton meters, Cole said quietly to himself, setting the digital display. He tightened the bolts in a precise diagonal cross pattern, top left, bottom right, top right, bottom left, bringing the block down evenly against the O-ring seals so the internal cavities wouldn't twist under load. The torque wrench let out a sharp, clear beep at each corner as the exact specification was reached. Finally, he reconnected the 6 pneumatic lines, pushing the quick connect collars home until they snapped with audible clicks. He stepped out of the cell and closed the heavy glass safety door until the latch engaged. "Turn on the main air supply to line 4, Cole said, wiping his hands on the rag from his back pocket. Kevin stood by the control console, hesitating, looking at Vivian for authorization. "Do what he said," Vivian snapped. Kevin reached forward and turned the primary pneumatic isolation valve 90 degrees. Hiss clunk. The sound of 1,200 pounds per square inch of compressed air rushing into the main manifold echoed inside the glass enclosure. Everyone held their breath, waiting for the high-pitched, screaming whistle of air escaping through a compromised seal or a warped bore channel. Nothing happened. There was only dead, absolute silence inside the cell. The pressure gauges on the digital readout panel beside the safety door jumped instantly from 0 to 1,200 pounds per square inch and locked there. The digital numbers didn't flicker. They didn't drop by a single tenth of a pound. The block was holding pressure like a solid piece of granite. Cole didn't look at the gauges. He looked at Leo and gave him a faint wink. "Run a cycle test," Cole said to the engineering lead. Kevin swallowed hard, leaned over the terminal, and hit the green system reset command. The amber beacons atop the enclosure turned off. A clean, solid green light illuminated the workspace. Inside the glass cell, the 6-foot robotic arm came to life. It moved with terrifying fluid speed, dropping down to the pallet, grabbing a heavy aluminum subassembly with its pneumatic gripper, lifting it 3 feet into the air, spinning 270 degrees on its base axis, and placing the part down onto the outgoing conveyor belt with a soft, perfectly dampened click. Whir clack, whir clack, whir clack. The arm cycled 3 times in 4 seconds. Smooth, rigid, flawless. Across the facility floor, the stalled downstream conveyor lines automatically kicked back into motion. The rhythm of the factory returned, a deep, resonant industrial heartbeat filling the massive space once again. Vivian Holt stood looking through the glass viewing window at the robotic arm as it moved. The tension that had held her shoulders rigid since 1 o'clock that afternoon finally drained away, leaving her looking tired, small, and suddenly very quiet in the center of her multi-million-dollar facility. She turned her head slowly, looking past the row of silent engineers, past the rolling tool cart, and fixed her eyes on Cole Davies. The rhythm of the assembly line didn't pause for applause. It didn't care about Kevin's flushed neck or Eric's heavy, wheezing exhale of relief. The automated conveyor belts clicked forward every 1.5 seconds, moving silver housings into the gripping fingers of the robotic arm, which pivoted, dropped, gripped, and lifted with mechanical indifference. Kevin stepped toward the safety enclosure, his hands hovering over the digital interface pad as if he could still justify his presence by pressing a button. "We should run a thermal imaging scan on the new block after 50 cycles, Kevin said, his voice tight, attempting to sound authoritative for the benefit of the junior engineers standing behind him. "If his alloy expansion coefficient doesn't match the factory spec, we could see seal degradation by shift end." Vivian didn't even turn her head toward him. She kept her eyes fixed on the smooth, quiet strokes of the machine. "Pack up your diagnostic carts," she said. Her voice wasn't raised. It didn't need to be. "Take your team back to the 3rd floor engineering wing. I want a full written report on my desk by 8 o'clock tomorrow morning, explaining why an external vendor had to diagnose a stress fatigue fracture that occurred on a line you signed off on last Tuesday." Kevin opened his mouth, his tongue clicking against his teeth as he searched for a corporate phrase. Unforeseen variable, vendor manufacturing variance, anomalous operational loads that might deflect the blame. But he looked at Vivian's profile, saw the absolute stillness in her posture, and thought better of it. He unclipped his digital tablet from the monitor cart, gave Cole a brief, sour glance, and walked down the aisle toward the exit stairs. His junior team shuffled out after him like sheep leaving a dry pasture. Cole was already packing his tools. He wiped the T-handle metric wrenches with his rag, dropped them into their elastic slots in the canvas bag, and snapped the molded plastic case of his digital torquer wrench shut. "You left a smudge on the glass," Leo said, pointing at the safety window where Cole's gloved hand had braced against the frame during the leak check. Cole pulled a clean microfiber cloth from his side pocket, wiped the polycarbonate pane until it was clear, and looked down at his son. "Better?" "Acceptable," Leo said, echoing the exact word Cole used whenever a machined part passed final inspection on the surface plate. Vivian stepped around the rolling cart. She had watched the exchange between father and son with a strange, analytical curiosity, as if she were trying to reverse engineer a mechanism she hadn't seen before. Up close, under the harsh, shadowless industrial lighting of the clean floor, the exhaustion on her face was more pronounced. There were faint dark circles beneath her eyes, partially concealed by expensive cosmetic concealer, and the skin around her mouth was tight with the permanent strain of carrying a $20 million weekly burn rate on her shoulders. "My office is on the mezzanine level," Vivian said, gesturing toward the glass-walled structure overlooking the bay. "Bring your son. I'll have Eric process the check." "Eric doesn't need to process anything," Cole said, zipping his tool bag shut and hoisting it onto his shoulder. "Write it from the emergency petty cash account or draw a corporate check. Just make it out to Davies Precision and Repair." Vivian stood her ground for a second, her heels clicking softly against the epoxy floor as she shifted her stance. She wasn't used to people dictating transaction logistics to her inside her own building, but she looked at line 4, humming smoothly, pushing out $40,000 worth of finished assemblies every 60 seconds, and nodded once. "Upstairs," she said simply. They followed her up the steel staircase. Leo kept one hand on the aluminum handrail, his head turning constantly to track the overhead transport trolleys sliding along the ceiling tracks. Vivian's office was large, sterile, and entirely functional. There were no family photographs on the massive slate desk, no decorative paintings on the matte gray walls. The only personal items were a brushed steel espresso machine sitting on a sideboard and a stack of leather-bound project ledgers neatly aligned beside a multi-monitor computer workstation. Through the floor-to-ceiling glass wall, the entire manufacturing campus stretched out below them like a miniature city of iron and light. "Sit," Vivian said, pointing to 2 low-slung leather chairs opposite her desk. Cole didn't sit. He set his tool bag down beside the door, walked over to the glass wall, and looked down at the layout of the plant. Leo climbed into one of the oversized leather chairs, his legs dangling 6 inches above the carpet, and pulled his toy car out to roll it silently across the armrest. Vivian walked behind her desk. She didn't reach for her checkbook immediately. Instead, she opened the leather portfolio Eric had left on the corner of her desk, pulled out the C-size engineering drawing of the pneumatic manifold, and smoothed it out across the slate surface. She looked at the drawing, then looked up at Cole's back. Eric told me you identified the internal stress point in less than 30 seconds, she said. "It wasn't hard," Cole said without turning around. His eyes were tracing the overhead blue air mains running toward the secondary stamping presses at the far east side of the building. "Whoever did your revisions reduced the wall thickness to increase flow volume. It's a common mistake when software draftsmen optimize for speed without calculating pneumatic pulse hammer." "That isn't what I'm asking about, Mr. Davies," Vivian said. Cole turned around slowly, leaning his hip against the edge of the glass wall. Vivian rotated the drawing so the bottom right corner faced outward. She tapped her index finger directly onto the title block. "CD-AR, CH-2021, she read aloud. Her voice was flat, devoid of its earlier impatience, replaced by a cold, sharp intelligence that had built an enterprise from nothing. "When we acquired the intellectual property rights for this automated assembly platform 3 years ago from a boutique holding company in Chicago, the primary architecture package came with a non-disclosure clause regarding the original design consultant. The holding company told us the primary architect had retired from the industry and wasn't available for implementation oversight. She looked straight at Cole's face. You didn't just recognize the symbology on this drawing, did you? She asked. You didn't just guess the operating pressure was 1200 psi because of the actuator cycle time. Cole looked at the letters on the paper. He felt that familiar, heavy weight in his chest. The ghost of a past life when he wore button-down shirts that didn't smell like soluble cutting oil, sitting in airport lounges drinking overpriced espresso while sketching assembly topologies on digital tablets. 1200 ps? I gives you the exact actuation speed required to sync with the linear conveyor without causing mechanical bounce on the pallet stops, Cole said quietly. If you run it lower, the assembly drifts out of timing window. If you run it higher, the solenoid spools bind after 50,000 shifts. Vivian leaned her palms on her desk. You designed the core architecture for this entire line, not just the manifold, the overhead transfer grids, the spatial geometry between the cells. 5 years ago, Cole said. Under contract, I handed over the CAD files, cashed the final invoice, and transferred the IP rights. It's your plant, Ms. Holt. Vivian slowly lowered herself into her high-backed executive chair. For the first time since she had walked into his dusty cinderblock shop on the frontage road 4 hours earlier, she looked at Cole Davies not as a grease-stained tradesman to be managed, but as a peer, or perhaps something more dangerous than a peer, someone who understood the foundation of her empire better than the people she paid 6 figures to maintain it. Why? She asked. The word hung in the quiet office, punctuated only by the soft hum of the air conditioning system and the faint click-clack of Leo's toy car on the leather armrest. Why what? Cole asked. Why are you running a machine shop in a condemned commercial corridor turning hydraulic bushings for tractors? She gestured toward the window, down at the gleaming, hyper-modern expanse of the facility. Do you have any idea what my firm pays for systems architects capable of mapping multi-axis automated lines from scratch? Kevin makes $240,000 a year, plus an annual performance bonus, and he couldn't diagnose a stripped cap screw without a committee meeting. A lead architect with your intuitive grasp of physical dynamics commands $400,000 on the open market. Easily. Cole pulled his rag from his back pocket, turned it over in his hands, and tucked it away again. He looked at Leo. The boy was leaning back in the oversized chair, yawning, his eyelids beginning to droop from the long afternoon in the shop and the excitement of the factory visit. 4 years ago, Cole said, his voice level, stripped of any melodrama or self-pity, my wife was diagnosed with stage 4 glioblastoma, brain cancer. Vivian stopped moving. Her hands grew still on the slate desk. When you work as a lead systems architect, Cole continued, stepping away from the glass and walking toward the center of the room, you don't work 40 hours a week. You don't even work 60. Your brain belongs to the project topology. You wake up at 3 in the morning thinking about buffer overflows in the PLC logic. You take conference calls from hospital waiting rooms while your wife is getting radiation therapy because the client in Stuttgart doesn't care that your personal life is falling apart. They care that the robotic assembly cell is running 20 minutes behind schedule. Wasn't so. He stopped at the edge of the desk, looking down at the CAD layout. For 18 months, I tried to do both, Cole said. I hired home nurses. I sat at my laptop at midnight while she slept in the next room, grinding through stress simulations for holding companies that didn't know my name. And when she died, he paused, taking a slow, measured breath through his nose. I looked at my son, who was 3 years old at the time, and I realized I couldn't remember the last time I had spent a full Saturday with him without my phone buzzing in my pocket every 15 minutes. Vivian looked from Cole to Leo, who had finally let his head rest against the leather back of the chair, his breathing slowing into the deep, heavy cadence of sleep. So I dissolved the LLC, Cole said. I bought a second-hand CNC mill from an auction house in Cleveland. I signed a lease on a building that cost me $2,000 a month. When I turn a piece of steel on a manual lathe, the steel doesn't send me emails at midnight asking for a revised timeline. When 5 o'clock hits, I shut the breaker off on the phase converter, I lock the front door, and I go home and make macaroni and cheese with my boy. He leaned forward, placing his calloused knuckles on the clean slate surface of Vivian's desk. "You have a 700,000 square foot facility here, Ms. Holt," Cole said softly. "It's a beautiful piece of engineering, but it requires your life as fuel to keep the lights running. You haven't taken a weekend off in 3 years. You eat lunch out of plastic containers at your desk while reading production reports. You looked at my shop and saw a joke because it doesn't scale. I look at your life and see a prison built out of very expensive structural glass." The silence that followed was absolute. Vivian didn't break eye contact. Her face remained composed, but the hard, cynical armor she wore to negotiate with board members and union reps seemed to crack just for a second, revealing the sheer, suffocating weight beneath it. She opened the top drawer of her desk slowly. She pulled out a heavy corporate checkbook bound in black leather and unscrewed the cap of a fountain pen. She didn't offer him a job again. She didn't insult his intelligence by telling him he was wasting his potential. She understood, with the brutal clarity of a CEO who spent her life calculating trade-offs, that Cole Davies had run the numbers on his life and chosen a currency she couldn't match. She wrote the date, filled in the pay-to field with Davies' precision and repair, and wrote out the amount in clean, sharp cursive. She tore the check from the ledger and slid it across the slate desk toward him. Cole looked down at the paper. Pay to the order of Davies' precision and repair amount, $10,000. Memo: emergency engineering consultation and fabrication. Line 4. Cole didn't pick it up immediately. He tapped his finger on the number. "We agreed on 5,000, Cole said. 2,000 for the part, 3,000 for the emergency installation. You diagnosed a critical structural oversight in my engineering department that would have cost us another $500,000 by Friday," Vivian said, replacing the cap on her pen with a sharp click. "Consider the additional $5,000 a consulting fee for pointing out that my lead automation engineer needs supervision." Cole reached out, picked up the check, folded it once precisely down the center, and slid it into the breast pocket of his work shirt. "Fair enough," Cole said. They walked out together through the rear administrative corridor, Cole carrying his heavy canvas tool bag over his shoulder while holding a sleepy Leo by the hand. Vivian walked beside them, her high heels making a much slower, measured cadence against the tile floor than when she had first stormed into his shop that afternoon. Outside, the evening air had cooled slightly, the smell of cut grass from the landscaped campus mingling with the faint diesel exhaust of delivery trucks shifting trailers at the far docks. Cole's old Ford F-150 sat under the yellow security lights of the loading bay, looking worn, honest, and completely out of place against the backdrop of reflective glass and steel. He opened the passenger door, lifted Leo, who mumbled something intelligible about cardboard forts, and strapped him carefully into his booster seat, clicking the buckle securely across his chest. He closed the door with a solid, metallic thud, walked around to the truck bed, and dropped his tool bag into the secured steel job box behind the cab. When he turned around, Vivian was standing at the edge of the loading dock concrete, her arms crossed over her charcoal blazer, watching him. "If Line 4 throws an encoder fault next month," she said, her voice carrying across the quiet asphalt, "are you going to hang up on Eric if he calls your shop?" Cole pulled his keys from his pocket and unlocked the driver's side door. He paused, looking up at her. "If Line 4 throws an encoder fault next month, it means your electrical team ran the sensor wiring too close to the high-voltage servo leads, and you're getting induction bleed," Cole said flatly. "Tell them to wrap the encoder cables in grounded braided copper shielding and keep them 6 inches away from the power tracks. That'll solve it." Vivian stared at him for a long moment. A faint, genuine smile, small, dry, and completely devoid of corporate artifice, touched the corners of her mouth. "Goodbye, Mr. Davies," she said. "Take a Sunday off, Ms. Holt," Cole said, pulling himself up into the cab of the F-150. "The machines will still be here on Monday morning." He turned the key. The old truck engine turned over with a rough, uneven rumble, the power steering pump letting out its familiar low whine as he turned the wheel. He shifted into drive, eased off the concrete apron, and steered the worn F-150 down the long, manicured drive toward the primary exit gate. Vivian Holt stood alone on the loading dock for a long time after the red tail lights of his truck disappeared onto the highway. She listened to the deep, steady hum of her factory vibrating through the soles of her shoes. 700,000 square feet of tireless, automated precision running flawlessly in the dark. She reached into her jacket pocket, pulled out her platinum business smartphone, and stared at the glowing screen showing 17 unread emails from her executive board. Slowly, deliberately, she pressed the power button until the screen went black, slid the dead phone back into her pocket, and walked back inside her building alone. Cole Davies walked away from corporate prestige because he knew that no salary can buy back time with the people who matter most. Vivian Holt had every resource in the world, yet it took a single dad in a dingy machine shop to show her that true value isn't measured in quarterly revenue or square footage. What would you have done in Cole's shoes? Would you take the high-stress corporate millions or choose the peace of your own workshop? If this story hit home for you, hit that like button, share this video with someone who needs a reminder about what truly matters, and subscribe to the channel for more powerful, grounded stories about real life, resilience, and human connection.